To split or move, that's the question, and how to do those well. So, what do we do with unfinished work at the end of a sprint? Do we split the story and leave part of it in the current sprint and move the unfinished pieces to a new story for another sprint? Or do we leave the story intact and move the whole thing to the backlog or perhaps to the next sprint? Hmm. Before we answer that, let me ask another question, a completely different question. How long is it okay to drive on a flat tire or on our rims? When might we drive on a flat tire or our rims anyway? Usually when it's dangerous to do otherwise. So, what do lean agile coaches recommend? What's the best advice to give most teams in most cases? Well, some lean agile coaches calmly discuss the pros and cons of each approach. One thing we did agree on is that the operational goal for the team's best outcomes is for them to consume work that they can deliver within the sprint's 2-week time box. To get things done within a sprint, we agreed the best place and time to break down stories is prior to the sprint in which they consume the stories. In other words, during sprint planning. The worst time to split and move a story is at the end of a sprint because we did not finish our work. That's too late. At best, it's an emergency need to drive on our rims. The best way to break down stories is along logical value fault lines as described by the SPIDR or other similar methods. After splitting stories, the smaller stories need to follow the INVEST acronym guidance. If not, you're driving on the rims. If one coach suggested that splitting unfinished work was a necessary evil to avoid weird KPI results, the teams would often settle into splitting stories in every sprint. If another coach suggested keeping the stories intact and moving them to another sprint, teams would often just settle into moving stories from sprint to sprint. Sometimes it is necessary to split or move unfinished work. But if we find ourselves in this situation repeatedly, then asking ourselves why and solving that problem is more important than standardizing how to drive on our rims. Either way, teams got comfortable with the recommended tactics on how to drive on their rims, and when asked, they'd say, Coach so-and-so told me this was the way to do it. So, do we split or do we move? Well, Mike Cohn has been a leading authority on Scrum since Scrum began, and he has some ideas and suggestions. If the unfinished user story is not too big, Mike Cohn recommends moving unfinished stories, not splitting them. If a story is still valuable to the product owner, then Mike feels it's best to keep it intact. Everyone's already familiar with it in that form. However, Mike qualifies this by saying that he would functionally split the story if the product owner decided not to pursue the remainder until a much later date. So, what is this INVEST acronym, this litmus test? Where did it come from? It first appeared in an article by Bill Wake in 2003 and again in a book by Mike Cohn in 2004. Can you apply the INVEST acronym to the smaller user stories after splitting the larger one? Is it independent from the other stories or preferably independently releasable? Is it negotiable, phrased and framed to facilitate discussion between the product owner and the team about scope and content, not just a task assignment? Is it valuable to the customer? Is it estimable by the team? Is it small enough to finish within a sprint and preferably in under half a sprint? And finally, is it testable in how it's framed and approached? Splitting stories. So, what's the good and the bad of splitting stories? Most Agile tools provide a way to do the meat cleaver method of splitting. This is where we just chop the story apart based on what's completed and what remains. The new stories are almost guaranteed to fail the INVEST acronym guidance. There are some pros for doing this, but this technique is like driving on your rims. Most of the leading lean agile planning and tracking tools provide a split tool or option. This includes Rally, Target Progress, Digital AI, formerly version 1, Jira, and many others. Here is an example using Rally. So if we go into a Rally user story, we find in this particular faked version here, we have 3 tasks, 2 of which are complete, 1 of which is incomplete. And then if we want to split it, we can go to the vertical ellipsis and hit the split option. Then we have to zero out the points on the story on the left, which is the old story, and we move this 5 points to the story on the right, which will be the new story. The old story will have the completed task, and the new story will have the incomplete task. Then we hit split, and it actually creates the 2 stories and puts it by default in the next sprint. In theory, these splitting mechanisms might help with breaking down larger items during planning, but a copy or cut and paste would work just as well. Split tools primarily exist for teams to chop a story apart when time runs out at the end of a sprint. Once splitting becomes habitual, the tool becomes a rope with which the teams can hang themselves. So what does good splitting look like? It's best to break stories into smaller stories during a planning phase, but try to use best practices even when splitting an in-progress story. Always try to break stories along logical value fault lines, such as the criteria recommended in the SPIDER method. So the SPIDER method has SPIDR. So S is for spikes. If there's a large degree of uncertainty, create spikes to go learn more before you decide how to approach the story. There are different paths you can consider. Draw a simple flowchart of what happens in the story. Each sequence of steps could possibly be its own story, or expand one big step of the flowchart into a story. And there are separate interfaces. You could split a story based on browser type or version or different hardware. Consider building a minimal user interface first and leave styling out of the interface initially. Then D for data. Look for different data paths or sources. Can the first story support valid data and later stories add support for invalid data? How about frequent types of data and less frequently seen types of data? Finally, there's R for rules. Sometimes a story is large because of the business rules, technology standards, or other things that must be supported. Consider relaxing support for these different rules in an initial story. Add support for additional rules in subsequent stories. So now let's talk about moving, good and bad moving. If moving instead of splitting, where do we move it? Do we move it to the backlog or to the next sprint? Well, as mentioned earlier, conceptually or literally, the story always goes to the backlog first. Even if it warrants inclusion in the following sprint, we can move it directly to the next sprint, but 2 things must be true before we do that. The product owner must be certain that the unfinished story is still higher priority than all the other work waiting on the backlog. And the product owner and stakeholders must decide what comes out of the next sprint's previous plan to make room for the rollover work. Or, without coercion, the team must agree to work extra hours to do both the previous plan and the rollover work. Remember, rollover work does not increase our capacity. The discomfort regarding incomplete work does not magically grow the size of our factory. This can lead to cascading causal loops, the perpetuating habit of pushing work down the road. Beware the rollover causal loop. The urgency to evade the cost and consequence of our failure to deliver previous commitments can motivate us to make an extra effort. That's fine and it sounds noble, but this can settle into a recurring toxic, unsustainable loop. By this, we mean if we shove unfinished work into an upcoming sprint but fail to remove work, we may finish the previously incomplete work, but then fail to finish the work that was previously planned. This can cause a cascading failure indefinitely. The explanation will always be we had to complete the rollover work. So let's focus on the right things. Let's not expend too much energy, effort, or time trying to standardize bad practices. Move a story when you must, and split a story when you must, but don't get comfortable driving on your rims. Spend more effort on breaking down the work wisely based on functional or logical business fault lines during planning. Stop overcommitting. Work at a sustainable pace. Seek 80% utilization as a norm. Detect and squash causal loops, and stop starting and start finishing.